Welcome back to the archives for round 2 of the Evangel October Open. In this round, I am facing Sam once again. This is now the 4th rated game I've played Sam in, the 3rd time in just the last couple of months, including lots of casual games. And so I wanted to switch it up a little bit. Last game, he surprised me by playing 1b3. So this time, I played 1c4. The first rated game I've ever played the English. Never played it before, not really a d4 player. So just kind of go get a reasonable position and play some chess. So he plays e5, which I was a little surprised at. I don't know why, but I was expecting maybe a symmetrical English. He does like a lot of fianchetto setups. So e5 a little surprising, but I just developed normally, and he played bishop b4. So this seemed very different than a lot of his other openings. Black voluntarily gives up the bishop pair in order to get rid of this annoying knight and damage white's structure. And he played immediate d5. And during the game, I thought perhaps I had already made a mistake, because it feels like black's going to get good control over the center. If I ever develop my knight to f3, they're going to get to play e4. And e4 is a move that black often likes to play against the English. So it felt like maybe black was getting something. At the same time, though, I remembered seeing some GM games from a couple of tournaments a while back where in the English they let the black pawns get pretty far up the board, and then they played moves like f3 to undermine the e4 pawn. And so I thought, well, if nothing else, I'll get castled, and I'll go ahead and I'll play f3. And my bishop will always be able to get onto another reasonable diagonal, or I'll be able to open up the diagonal further by capturing on e4. So I figured that black was getting a reasonable position, but that I still had some ideas. So now black has this nice center. But I think the center might already be overextended. Looking back on it, doing some analysis after the game, it seems like d5 may have needed some more preparation. In the master database, we really don't have any games at all, because d5 isn't normally played. In this position, c6 isn't normally played. Here, normally d6, knight c6, knight f6. Black needs to get those pieces out before they go and open up the center, which makes sense, because the person that opens up the center is the person that should be more developed. Right? If you've got a development lead, that's when you open up the game. So for black to open up the center with no pieces developed, it should kind of be a red flag. And we immediately see that white gets another piece developed, and black makes another pawn move. So yes, these pawns are annoying, they're advanced, but my knight actually sits on d4 really nicely. So I wasn't unhappy with this position. Once the pawn got to e4, it was a lot less scary than whenever I thought the pawn was going to e4. So the threat, more scary than the execution in this case. They developed knight to c6, and I just let them capture. This d4 pawn seems relatively strong. And now I've got those ideas of playing d3, f3, and trying to undermine black's pawns in the center. And as black was also thinking about that possibility, they played f5 to kind of strengthen that e4 pawn. But this really weakens the black king, and we can see black still doesn't have any pieces developed. And so once black played f5, I thought my position was very nice. I thought my position was better, because I didn't see a clear way for the black king to ever get safe. And my king has managed to get safe. I don't have great control over the center, but ironically, neither does black. While they do have pawns on f5 and d5, the pawn on e4 is kind of past the center. And so if I can play around this pawn's attacks on f3 and d3, I should be comfortable. So I go ahead and try and undermine it right away. They develop their knight. And here, perhaps even just f3 right away would make sense. But I thought queen b3 was annoying. Going ahead and preventing their bishop from developing, hitting the weak d5 pawn. I thought maybe I could attack down the b file, had ideas of playing bishop to a3, just trying to finish development. And my queen also helps support these two squares that are under attack from their pawn, supporting that f3 idea still. They played queen b6, which after I played queen b3, so I thought queen b3 was pretty annoying. There's also an idea here that if they castle right away, I play bishop captures d5, and their d pawn, or bishop captures e4, and their d5 pawn is pinned to the king. And so that was something to keep in mind. And they played queen b6, which I thought of after I played queen b3, but before they played it. And I thought queen b6 looks like a reasonable try here. And I just concluded that if I capture on b6 and give them those doubled pawns, they'll be easy to target, and I'll be happy with my position. However, it seems that queen to a3 or queen to a4 check may have been stronger, keeping the queens on the board. With the bishop pair, with their king more exposed, there's probably no reason for me to so willingly trade the queens. So yeah, I think I like throwing in this check, or even going queen to a3 to hit this knight so they can't castle. I'm not really worried about losing the d4 pawn, but queen a4 does keep that pawn also. If the queen ever captures the pawn, I even have the move bishop to e3. And this idea of putting the bishop in front of the e pawn is pretty common in English positions. All right, so I went ahead and made the exchange. Not any worse here. Just kind of missed out on perhaps a better advantage. And while I talked about trying to get on the b file and attack their b pawns, I do have to watch out for my a pawn. I just continue with my plan to undermine their center. I want to open up the position more and more because I felt like my development was better, and I've got the two bishops. So the more open the position, the better. And they go ahead and play this rook lift, attacking my d pawn. And so now I've got a decision of whether or not to defend my d pawn, and if I do, how to defend my d pawn. I've got two ways to defend it with the bishop, one way to defend it with the pawn, and one way to defend it with the rook. I didn't really like the move bishop to e3 because I wasn't sure that this was a useful diagonal in the long run. I really wanted to be on this diagonal towards their rook and king side. I didn't like the idea of playing e3 because I thought I might want to recapture on f3 with the pawn. Because if I recapture with the bishop or the rook, I do have an isolated e pawn. I wasn't sure which way I would recapture yet on f3 if I did, but I wanted to have that option. And I didn't want to make this rook leave the f-file because the f-file was likely to be open. They're likely to have a rook on the f-file, so this rook's already developed. It's already where it needs to be. So I decided I did not need to defend the d-pawn. Instead, I went ahead and captured on e4 and captured with the bishop. And my idea was that if the rook ever captures the d-pawn, I'm going to block that file with the bishop on d3. This is kind of a theme for the rest of the game, where my bishops are the ones that really control the files. They're able to prevent black's rooks from getting super active, and I'm able to block the files they want to use using my bishops rather than my rooks, especially this light square bishop. So what I expected was rook captures d4 and bishop to d3. Nice open position, lots of weaknesses on black's side of the board, and I could play from there. However, my opponent threw in the move bishop to h3. And this move ends up being pretty annoying. I need to be careful because of my back rank. If my rook leaves the back rank and they capture on d4 and get down to d1, I'm either going to get checkmated or my king's going to go for a run. So this move ends up being pretty annoying to deal with. But I also thought that it couldn't be good. It felt wrong in the position. I felt that there are other things black needed to do, like try and get this pawn back, trying to get their king safe or their rook active. So I took a good amount of time here trying to think of the best way to move this rook in a useful way. Because if I can make a useful move with this rook and say, I don't care that you played bishop h3, I wanted to move this rook anyway, it makes bishop h3 not a useful move. And so there are some ideas of going over to the d file and defending the pawn. But I didn't love that. I felt like the rook was a little bit passive just sitting there. I thought their bishop could even go back and hit the e-pawn in some cases. And again, that would be useful for the bishop. And I didn't want to leave the f file because then the king would get the castle and bring their other rook into the game. So the big decision was whether I could get away with rook to f4. And if I play rook to f4, black cannot capture on d4 because I would move the bishop with check. Well, not there because the knight would defend the rook, but to g6, check. And when they capture my bishop, I would capture their rook, winning material. So something like here, check. And now I'm up the exchange, and I'm happy. So I thought that rook f4 prevented them from taking the d-pawn. And this would be great if I could make a useful move with my rook that also kept the extra pawn. The issue that rook f4 runs into is the move g5. And again, I was thinking, okay, if I can prove that I've got a good move after g5, then g5 can't be good because it overextends that pawn, creates more weaknesses and space in black's camp. But if I can't prove that g5 is bad, then rook f4 is bad. So after rook f4, g5, I can't stay on the fourth rank. So if I move my rook again, they can go ahead and capture the d-pawn. Fortunately, though, there is a sequence of moves where I lose the d-pawn but get the g-pawn, and my position's pretty commanding from there. So I do eventually decide that rook f4 is the way to go. My opponent plays g5 quickly, as I expected, and I play the move rook to f6, attacking the b-pawn and also attacking the g-pawn. They capture on d4, and I play the bishop back to d3, blocking the file, making sure this rook isn't super active, and they've got two pawns that are under attack. And so they play the move rook to f8. And the idea of rook f8 is I cannot capture the b-pawn because then they would play the move rook to f1 checkmate. So I don't want to get checkmated, but bishop captures g5, defends the rook, and opens up the rest of the back rank for my a rook to defend. So now no real threats. Black trades, and I'm now forking the knight and the rook. So I go ahead and trade, and I go into this endgame where I have two extra pawns. Now, there are a couple of important things to note about the endgame right now. One, there are rooks on the board, so there's still a lot of play. I've got to be thinking about how to minimize the counterplay that black can get with their rook. Also, notice that there are same colored bishops. This makes all the endgames more likely to be one for one side or another, not as many draws, because the same colored bishops can fight over the same squares. So we go ahead and I go ahead and cut off that d file again, walk my king up, and then the rook, I'll actually say here, after playing rook to d2, the rook is trapped after bishop to d3, because if they ever move to the b file, I go ahead and play rook to b1, and they either have to trade the rook or I'm winning the b pawns. So I force the rook to move. We go ahead and make this trade. I'm happy to trade some of the pawns to get rid of their passed pawns because I've got the extra pawns at this point. And now I start pushing the h-pawn. And it seems pretty straightforward. My opponent plays the rook to the fifth rank to try and stop h5. And here I do have a decision. I decide to play rook to g5 and offer the rook trade. I think that this is, of course, winning for white because I have the two extra pawns if the rooks stay on the board. But it seemed like their rook could cause some problems. I was going to have to really be careful about how active that rook got, lots of different checks and pins and attacking my pawns from behind. So if I thought the bishop endgame was winning, it made sense to get rid of the rooks. So I actually trade into this endgame where I have two extra pawns, but they're doubled. So what about this endgame tells me that it's winning for white? One, same colored bishops. 2, my king's already active. 3, these pawns are going to promote on a white square. In fact, all 3 of my pawns are. This means their king can never hang out on the queening squares safely. So anytime they try to blockade it, I'm going to be able to kick the king off of that square. So my thought was that this endgame may even be winning if I give up my bishop for their pawn. Maybe not. Maybe it's a draw then. Maybe they have a fortress. I don't need to give up the bishop. But if everything goes wrong, I still should be perfectly fine giving up this bishop for their pawn. Also, notice that my king, since there's only one file in between the G pawns and the E pawn, my king can actually do a good job of defending all my pawns as they advance, leaving my bishop free to rearrange on different diagonals, stop their pawn. I don't have to have everything tied down playing defense on these pawns. So first job is to get my king up the board and kind of clear the way for the pawns. I want to be able to safely get these pawns, ideally, up to these dark squares. And then I can work on kicking their pieces off of the squares in front of my pawns. So we walk the king up, take opposition, but most importantly, put that king on a nice dark square where it's going to be able to defend my pawns as they advance all the way up the board. Now their king is on a light square, and I can probably get away with advancing this pawn or rearranging my bishop, but it didn't seem like it was going to hurt me to get this E pawn rolling, right? If I can threaten 2 pawns to become queens, that's even harder to stop. So we go ahead and march this E pawn up the board. And in this position, they have their king in front of one pawn, their bishop defending the other pawn, their pawn not a threat to queen. And white needs to be a little bit precise here, because if I simply just advance this pawn up to G6, their bishop might be able to sit on this square. Maybe it wouldn't be able to. Maybe I'd just be able to play bishop d3 there. But I thought this was a good moment to be precise. And I played the move bishop to e6. Just kind of ending the game right away. Perhaps I can just push the g-pawn, because they might just get in a zugzwang and run out of moves. Well, maybe they go this way. They can't yet. Yeah, so if my pawn gets to g6 or g5, they could go to h5, and then I could push my pawn to g6. They wouldn't be guarding this square. Okay, so maybe pushing the pawn also worked fine. Yeah, I did consider it, but I saw that bishop e6 was very clean because it trades off the bishops. And if I trade off the bishops, then it's a winning king-pawn endgame. But more importantly is that if the bishop captures, I just promote with check. And I'm going to checkmate. So bishop e6, capture, check, check, and checkmate. So they can't capture my bishop because they're leaving the defense of the queening square. And so they go ahead and move their king. And I promote. And their pawn's not fast enough. So I thought it was an instructive endgame because even though we both had bishops left, since they were same colored bishops, it was very clean for white to win as long as they limited counterplay, especially when the rooks were on the board. And we really looked at who was controlling those squares or able to control the squares where the pawns were going to queen and on the way to those queening squares, right? Our king got to f6, and that really helped control the path for both of the pawns. Also, I thought it was a fun game because we went into an opening that I had never played before. I'm not sure how much my opponent had played those types of positions, but it was nice to get into a real fresh position against a familiar opponent and keep them on their toes, right? Next time they have the black pieces, they're going to be wondering, am I going to play c4? The first time I played them, I played d4. I've played some e4 against them. So I want to stay unpredictable against these local players that are a little lower rated to make sure that I don't just give them an easy advantage out of the opening, force them to play some chess, especially if I have not had a time to prep against them. So a little bit of mind games, always a fun part of tournament chess on the local level. All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed. I will see you next time for round 3. 3 of the Evangel October Open, where I will be taking on the reigning state champion. And that will be an exciting game. So stay tuned for that. Good luck in your games and your studies, and I'll see you next time.